Good evening, everyone. Thank you for coming. I think we're going to have an extremely interesting and enlightening panel tonight. My interest in it, I am a lawyer, but I don't practice juvenile law, so I didn't really know much about it until I heard a very animated speech by a judge in Clackamas County and got me started thinking about that. There is very exciting and promising research and implementation of new programs to improve outcomes for youth who have contact with both the child welfare system and the juvenile justice system. They're known as crossover youth, and there's quite a lot of activity on this across the country, implementing new programs. And our first speaker tonight is Deena Corso. She's a senior manager with Multnomah County Department of Community Justice in the Juvenile Services Division. She's been with Multnomah County for 23 years and is currently responsible for, deep breath, pre-adjudication services, treatment services, and community interface services within the Juvenile Services Division. She has extensive experience in all areas of juvenile justice, including juvenile justice reform. She received her bachelor's degree in psychology from the University of Illinois and her master's degree in counseling psychology from the University of Oregon. She's a licensed professional counselor. Following Ms. Corso, we will have presenters Margaret Braun and Shannon Myrick from the Oregon Youth Authority. Margaret's been a senior research analyst with the Oregon Youth Authority since 2013. She received her undergraduate degree in psychology from the University of Colorado with highest honors, and her master's degree and PhD in applied psychology from Portland State University. Margaret joined the Oregon Youth Authority, the state's juvenile justice agency, as a senior research analyst in 2013. In her spare time, she also sings soprano in the Portland Symphonic Choir. And next to Margaret is Shannon Myrick. She's the Strategic Initiatives Manager for the Oregon Youth Authority. She advises the agency's leadership on data-based decision-making. She was instrumental in developing OYA's Youth Reformation System, a culture-changing initiative that uses advanced research to help troubled youth lead productive, crime-free lives. Shannon's an expert on adolescent development and its relationship with juvenile justice. She received her undergraduate degree from the University of Oregon and her master's and doctorate degrees from Portland State University, where she also serves as an adjunct professor of psychology. Welcome, please, our three illustrious speakers tonight.
Thank you.
Deena?
So, there we go. I was going to say, I don't know if this is working. We'll check it now. Hello, and thank you for having me. I am thrilled that there are this many people out there that are interested in this topic. This is something, obviously, that's near and dear to my heart as a 23-year veteran of juvenile justice, and I'm excited by it, but it's fun that there are other people that have an interest as well that don't eat, sleep, and breathe it. So it's an honor to get to talk with you tonight. I am going to start us off with a conversation about something that is called the crossover youth practice model, and my hope is, if this works. It worked.
I did it, yeah.
Oh, you did it.
You just let me know.
Okay, I'll just point. My hope is, in a very short period of time, to give you an overview of what the crossover youth practice model is, to talk to you a bit about how we have implemented the model here in Multnomah County, and if there's time, but I'm not sure if we'll get to it or not, some lessons that we've learned through our implementation of this model. So I'm going to give you a very high-level overview of what the crossover youth practice model is, because we could probably literally spend a day and not cover all the weeds and all the details about the model. But if you're very intrigued and need some good bedtime reading, there is a website where you can read the entire 121-page manual that describes all the research behind the model itself, the goals, the outcomes that are expected, the practices, the protocols, all of that stuff. So if you find yourself inspired after this overview, you can do a little more digging. So I want to set the stage by giving you a couple of acronyms that you'll see throughout the presentation. The letters CW stand for Child Welfare. DHS is the Department of Human Services, but in the context of this presentation, we're just focused on the DHS child welfare caseworkers. There are other social service entities within that state agency, but when I say DHS, or if you see DHS on the slides, we're really just talking about child welfare. JJ stands for Juvenile Justice, and a JCC is a juvenile court counselor. Juvenile court counselors are county employees who do case management in cases that are delinquencies, so where a law violation has been alleged against a young person. You could think of them as probation officers. They supervise youth that are on probation, among other things. So just sort of wanted to set the stage so that you're not confused by those acronyms that are going to pop up on the screens. So first of all, what is Crossover Youth Practice Model? It started in about 2007 as a partnership between the Casey Family Programs and Georgetown University's Center for Juvenile Justice Reform. They looked at a lot of very convincing research that said that we were not doing a great job for youth who were dually involved in both the child welfare and the juvenile justice systems, and they came up with some protocols, some specific practices that needed to be in place in order for these dually involved youth who are involved in two systems to have better outcomes than we were seeing. The research was telling us that these youth typically had. So there's three different ways that different jurisdictions identify who are their crossover youth. The broadest definition of a crossover youth is any youth that has experienced both maltreatment, whether it's come to the attention of the authorities or not, and engaged in delinquent behavior, whether they have been caught and adjudicated or not. So that would be the broad brush. You might dabble in one or both, but you haven't actually been formally sucked into the system. The next level of crossover is the dually involved youth, and these are youth that have definitely entered into both the child welfare and the juvenile justice systems, but they may be receiving services informally. So both systems, child welfare and juvenile justice, are able to intervene with kids and their families without a court ordering them to participate. They can offer informal sanctions on the juvenile justice side, or informal services called FSS, Family Support Services, in the child welfare system to assist families in being able to get their needs met, so that the court doesn't have to intervene and the state doesn't have to take custody of the children. So the dually involved youth is actually the population in Multnomah County that we decided to focus our crossover efforts on. So we don't want kids to have to wait until they're formally involved as both a delinquent and a dependent to be able to receive crossover interventions and services. The most restrictive category of crossover youth would be youth who are actually adjudicated on a delinquency and under the jurisdiction of the court for delinquent behavior, and also the state has taken custody of them as dependent kids due to abuse and neglect allegations. I'm not going to read this whole thing to you. I'm going to point out the highlights. This is, why does it matter? There's a whole bunch of research that says that children who are exposed to physical and sexual abuse and maltreatment have a life trajectory that has all sorts of negative outcomes. One of those is getting involved in delinquency, but there's also mental health and educational difficulties, occupational difficulties with unemployment and underemployment when they get older, public health issues, safety concerns. So there's very clear and convincing research that says that young people who enter the child welfare system who are experiencing abuse and neglect or some sort of maltreatment tend to have negative outcomes as they get older. So quite a few studies have been done on this particular crossover youth population, the kids who are dually involved. 5 particular studies that I've highlighted here weren't identical in their methodology, but they all came up with very consistent findings, and that is that early childhood abuse and neglect is associated with an increased risk for crime and violence. And here's the happy news: there's something we can do about it. The relationship is not a death sentence. It's not a your life is over kind of a thing. There are things that we can actually do that can intervene to help get youth on a more positive life path. So just some other findings from the studies. There's a high prevalence of family history of criminal behavior, mental health, and substance abuse problems found in the population of youth who are identified as crossover. One study found that as many as 70% of crossover youth have been exposed to domestic violence. When we look at youth who are taken out of their home and placed in out-of-home care, the crossover youth tended to be in more placements, not just one out-of-home episode, but actually placed in multiple placements. And often with crossover youth, it's in a placement that's not a family sort of environment. It's a group home or we call it congregate care, a place where many children live that's not like a family foster home might be. Overall, crossover youth that enter the child welfare system when they're young, the younger they start, they tend to stay in the child welfare system longer. And if they enter young, they are typically younger at the time of their arrest than a child who entered the child welfare system older, or a child who never entered the child welfare system. They commit nearly twice as many offenses as their counterparts who did not enter the child welfare system young and are arrested more frequently. So the studies sort of vary on this, but like how many of these kids are we talking about? The range was 17% to 67% across the studies of kids. If you look at the whole juvenile justice population, how many of them cross over, or the whole child welfare, this is the juvenile justice population, how many cross over? You'll see that 1% of diversion cases, these are juvenile justice kids who are offered an alternative to being adjudicated and placed on probation. So the very front end of the system. Only 1% of that population are crossover youth or kids with child welfare involvement. If you look at the population of youth that are on probation, so a little deeper in the system, 7% are child welfare, duly involved kinds of cases. But if we look at kids that are involved in juvenile justice and have been removed from the home, then 42, or as high as 42% of those youth in these studies were shown to have been crossover kids. So what does that mean? We need to pay attention earlier to the needs of these youth, trying to prevent crossover or to intervene earlier so that they don't penetrate the juvenile justice system. Often I think I said this already, youth in the child welfare system stay in there for a long period of time. If they're crossover youth, they're more likely to be female than the general delinquency population. They're more likely to be youth of color, and in particular African American youth. They are represented in the crossover youth population, and I will say these are national data, but it is absolutely reflected in our Multnomah County data as well. They are often placed in multiple placements, like I said before, and there's a strong correlation with truancy or poor performance in school. This is alarming to me as a juvenile justice professional who actually thinks that detention isn't the greatest option for young people. More than half of crossover youth are detained prior to adjudication if they come into a detention setting. They are more likely than their non-crossover counterparts to be held in detention pending their hearing. And crossover youth are perceived as being a higher risk by juvenile justice decision makers than their non-crossover counterparts, which leads to harsher dispositions, which is like sentences in the adult language, than their peers who are not crossover. So what is the crossover practice model? This is a really kind of heady statement, but this model is a conceptual map or an organizational ideology that gives us definitions and explanations that teach us how staff need to partner with the families, service providers, and other stakeholders so that we can deliver service in a way that gets the best possible outcomes for these young people. So there are these 4 overarching goals of the crossover youth practice model. The first and foremost is to reduce the number of kids who are taken out of their homes in the first place. We know that youth tend to have better lifelong, long-term outcomes if they are able to be maintained in a community in a home setting. So our number 1 goal is to reduce the need to place children out of their homes. The second is reducing the use of congregate care, the group home sort of a approach to placing children, and instead rely, if a youth needs to be removed from their home for safety reasons or other reasons, that we would look for more traditional family types of setting. There's a goal of reducing disproportionate representation of children in color who are become crossover youth, as well as just a general reduction in the number of youth who are dually adjudicated. Remember, that means the state takes custody of you as a dependent, and you are also placed on formal probation or other sorts of sanctions, but you are adjudicated on a criminal on a crime. I'm not going to read all these to you, but I just wanted you to see that there's a whole bunch of interim outcome measures that are also built into the model that are designed to support those overarching goals. So, for example, reduction of use of detention. So once we put kids in detention, we're sort of helping them penetrate the system. So if we can reduce that initial entrance, then we can hopefully keep them from penetrating further into the system. The use of joint assessments, that last one I'm going to talk a little bit more about, but how child welfare and juvenile justice work together. Same with interagency information sharing, so that we're helping families in a collaborative way instead of working in silos. So again, I'm going to do these pretty quickly, so bear with me. I should have started by saying I violated the rules of not putting a lot of words on the screen, but I have more to say than I can say in 25 minutes, so there's a lot of words on the screen. So the practice model has 10 values and principles that are at the core of all of the different practices that are in place with the model. The first and foremost is that every child is an individual, and that their needs, their history, their experience need to be based on their own individual unique set of circumstances, and that there's a focus on achieving a sense of normalcy for youth. Again, that kind of gets back to that. It's trying to stay at home. If you can't be at home, be in another home-like setting, etc. There's a belief that the best place for kids is to be with their own family. If that's not possible, then a permanent family environment should be sought, and looking at extended family and community resources if that needs to happen. There's a belief in looking at youth and family strengths, and that systems, the providers, have a responsibility to learn how to use those strengths in order to meet the needs of the people that we're trying to serve. We want to look at people in their entirety, not as just a behavior or take things out of context and make decisions in silos. We want to look at families and how we can support healthy family functioning. The fourth one is that we believe that kids and families need to have a voice and be authentically engaged in their own planning, their own services, meaningfully involved. That doesn't just mean, here, we wrote this plan for you, can you please sign it? But they actually are involved in creating the plan, identifying their strengths, identifying their needs, developing the service plan. So meaningfully, maybe I should have put that one bold also, but meaningfully involved. The model requires an integrated approach between all the players that are involved with these families' lives, so juvenile justice and child welfare, of course, but then the courts and the education system and mental health / behavioral health, physical health as well should be on here, and that the systems need to partner in order to meet the needs of the family, as opposed to the expectation that the family is going to adapt and jump through all of the various hoops that the different systems have set up on their own. That we, the helpers, need to actually collaborate and be in partnership and meet the needs of the family. The practices need to be fair and equitable with a focus on honoring and respecting the beliefs and values of the families that we're serving. There's a focus on reducing racial disproportionality and eliminating disparities in both child welfare and juvenile justice system. We focus heavily on professional development. Training is critical for both the line staff and the supervisors, and then the staff need to have the supervision and the training that they need to be able to do the model with fidelity, the way it's intended to be done. And we rely on data and evidence. Our data people. And when out-of-home placement is absolutely necessary, that there's a focus on youth permanence, not leaving kids wondering what's going to happen to me and what's my future and does anybody love me and where am I going to go next, but that really focusing on permanency in terms of the planning for youth's future. So these are principles that guide the policies and practices, all of the services and supports that are in place within the crossover youth practice model. So I love this slide. I have to say I sort of borrowed to make it, but at its core, the practice model to me is a culture change, and it is the coming together of two different entities that have historically worked in isolation of one another and creating a shared vision about how we can work together or play in each other's sandbox. So the traditional child welfare perspective is that the youth is a victim. They place sanctions or requirements on the parent, but it gets really frustrating when the victim youth that you're working with is a teenager, because really you just want somebody to come in and hold this teenager accountable, because really the only hammer that you have as a child welfare worker is with the parent. On the other side of the coin, you've got juvenile justice that sees the youth as the perpetrator. The sanctions are all on the youth. The court order is about what the youth has to do. But also there's like if only the parent would stop using drugs, or if only the parent would provide better supervision. So there's these very different perspectives that sometimes can be placed upon the exact same family. So the idea of the practice model is that you're sort of being able to see each other's perspective, and you're bringing the resources of child welfare and the resources of juvenile justice in a collaborative, partnering kind of a way to meet the needs of the family and make sure that everybody is getting served throughout the family system. I am not going to go into detail on this. This is the 121-page manual. If you want to read more about it, you can find it there, but I do want you to see that the model is very prescriptive about 3 different phases and 5 different practice areas that when a jurisdiction decides that they want to become part of the crossover youth practice model, the trainers from Georgetown come and sit with very big groups of people to try and hammer out the very fine details about how each of these practice areas within each of these different phases are implemented. So I just have a couple of examples, the next screen. So for example, in the first phase, sites are required to think very specifically about different practices around identification of who are your crossover youth. So you have to come up with very specific protocols and who's going to do what and who's going to notify whom and where is that going to be put into the database and all of that kind of thing. A memorandum of agreement needs to be in place between the 2 agencies around how they're going to share information and protect confidentiality and all of that good stuff. The caseworker for child welfare and the juvenile justice worker need to attend each other's hearings. So, for example, when a youth has a delinquency hearing, they need to, the child welfare worker needs to attend that delinquency hearing, and then vice versa. So the idea, again, being everybody knows what's happening in both systems. So workers have to maintain regular communication, and we measure that, and we make sure it's documented. And then the model requires a consolidated court process. So here in Multnomah County, we use one judge, one family. There's different models for how you do a consolidated court process, but the idea is, again, you don't have one family that's involved in a whole bunch of different court proceedings and processes, but that you've got one judge that actually understands the whole context in the life of a family. So quickly, here in Multnomah County, we started implementing the crossover youth practice model in 2010. We had the wonderful Judge Nan Waller as our champion. She learned about crossover in, I'm sure, one of her many, many travels around the nation and talking to important people, and said we should be doing that here. So we did. And we made a conscious decision early in our implementation, again, to target the duly involved youth. We didn't want to wait until they were formally involved in both systems before we would apply this model. We did have significant turnover in key positions that I would say slowed our implementation progress, but once we had those leadership roles replaced by new committed people that were very clear about their commitment, we got back on track, and we are now fully implemented in Multnomah County. The other site that is fully implemented in Oregon is Marion County, and both Washington County and Lane County are just about to launch, and so Multnomah County has been serving as mentors to Washington County, and Marion County has been serving as mentors to Lane County. So just very high level, we have about 50 youth at any given time that are identified as crossover. The majority, 75% of our kids, start out as child welfare and cross over into juvenile justice. We count them if they go the other way. It just happens in our county that mostly they start in child welfare, become juvenile justice. About 10% of those of our crossover youth are placed in the state's custody because of their delinquency. For example, a youth who commits a sex offense and the victim is a sibling and they can't be in the home anymore and they need to be placed out of the home. They might be placed in child welfare custody. CSEX stands for commercially sexually exploited children. We have youth who are commercially sexually exploited and cannot be kept safe in their homes and typically have all sorts of trauma history and mental health needs and all of that. And so they will sometimes end up in DHS custody. So about 10% of our crossover kids become crossover as a direct result of their delinquent behavior. Again, as I mentioned, girls and African American youth are overrepresented in our Multnomah County population, just like the national data. And we have been very focused since our implementation on evaluating our fidelity to the model. Are we implementing the model the way it is intended to be implemented? So this is just a picture of what it kind of looks like, and I'll do this super fast because I'm mindful of the time. Youth enters our system means they come to the doors of juvenile justice, and our data services people look at the police report and they look in ORCIDS, which is the state DHS computer system, and see if it might possibly be a crossover kid. We don't have the level of access to be able to know for sure, but they can tell if it might be. So if it looks like it might be, then our data services person talks to our DHS liaison who confirms one way or the other if it's a crossover youth. So if it is, then the DHS liaison lets our juvenile court counselor and the DHS caseworker know that this is a crossover kid, and that means now you have to start doing some things differently or extra, and they go on a list of who are they. I won't bore you with the details, but we track now this is a crossover youth case. So within 7 days, the two workers are required to talk to each other. Such a novel concept, right? What are you doing? What are you doing? How are you being helpful? How are you being helpful? And then within 30 days, they're required to set up a meeting with the family, the two workers and the family, to explain and clarify roles, to talk about what it means to be a crossover case, to answer questions, to talk about who might have resources for what, and to do joint planning. As I mentioned, they attend each other's hearings. They come up with a collaborative and family-focused case plan, and then they're required to have ongoing contact throughout the life of the case at a minimum of monthly. So one of the handouts that's passed out is this checklist. So how are we, what are we doing to sort of help the workers remember they need to do these things? The checklist sheet that's back there has what the juvenile justice checklist is on one side and the child welfare on the other. But this is just sort of a reminder, once a youth is identified as crossover, this is in their file and they have to remember to do these certain things, and then they check it off, and they even are reminded to document it. Put it in your notes that it actually happened so that we can count it, because we can't count it if you don't write it down. So we implemented these checklists to help the workers. The judges also expect the workers to show up at each other's hearings and will ask crossover related questions, and they will check off if each other attends the hearings. And we have changed our court reports so that it actually requires the worker, when you're writing a court report, to note whether it's a crossover case. So I don't think I have time to do this.
I'm afraid not.
So I am going to wrap it up there, but I hope that you found that useful and informative.
Thank you, Deena. I think that's really good information. We know what's going on, what's being implemented to really provide solutions for the youth. Now we're going to hear from Margaret Braun, who is a researcher, as I mentioned. And Margaret, explain.
Thank you, yes, and thank you for having us here today. We are always very happy to come and talk about the Oregon Youth Authority and the ways that we're working to improve outcomes for youth in the community. And this evening we are going to introduce you to OYA and provide an overview of the youth we serve. And then we'll be focusing on some of the research that we're doing with the hope that we might be able to prevent youth from entering our care and custody in the first place. And also touching on a couple of key initiatives that the agency is working on right now. Thank you. So first, a quick overview of what the Youth Authority does. The mission of the Oregon Youth Authority is to protect the public and reduce crime by holding youth offenders accountable and providing opportunities for reformation in safe environments. The vision of the Oregon Youth Authority is that youth who leave OYA go on to lead productive, crime-free lives. And probably the biggest reason for that, our mission, vision, values, is that in almost all cases, the youth that we serve are going to end up re-entering our communities at one point or another. When they leave our care and custody, we want them to be our good neighbors, our good coworkers, and our good participants in our community. So this slide provides a visual of where youth are served within the Oregon Youth Authority. We serve about 1,500 youth on both community supervision and in closed custody. And when I say closed custody, that is specifically commitment to a youth correctional facility. The majority of our youth in our care and custody are adjudicated as juveniles and served in the community on OYA probation, so served by one of our many field offices in the counties. And about 600 youth are currently in OYA closed custody. A little over half are committed as juveniles, and so they are under the authority of the Oregon Youth Authority. And then a little less than half are actually committed as adults, and we refer to those as our DOC youth. They were adjudicated as adults, but they are served by OYA due to their age. This graphic is a little bit busy, but I really like it because it kind of shows you the good news that very few of all of the youth that are in Oregon's population end up touching our system. You can see here that of the approximately 390,000 youth who are in Oregon between the ages of 10 and 17, fewer than 600 of them ended up in OIA's custody in 2013. And those who do come to OIA are really the state's most delinquent youth, who have the most needs. So a little bit more about the characteristics of the youth that we serve. The numbers I'm showing you here represent all youth in OIA custody, so those are both youth who are served in the community as well as in close custody. The youth represent all demographic groups, but as you can see from these figures, we do receive a disproportionate number of some groups relative to the percentage of the general population of Oregon. For example, Caucasians make up about 88% of the Oregon general population, but only about 58% of our youth make up. The Hispanic population in Oregon is about 12%, but you can see from this graphic we get about 25% at the Oregon Youth Authority. Native Americans, we get about 4% of our population is of Native American background, and that's a little bit more than the 2% that's in the Oregon general population. And then African American youth comprise about 9% of our care and custody, whereas they're only about 2% in the Oregon general population. And this disproportionate contact is particularly true in our close custody settings, where we receive an even lower proportion of Caucasian youth and a higher proportion of youth from each of the other demographic categories. We serve youth between the ages of 12 and 24 who committed crimes prior to their 18th birthday, so we can serve a youth up until their 25th birthday. OIA maintains legal and physical custody of youth offenders who are adjudicated to OIA by juvenile courts, and OIA has physical custody but not legal custody of youth offenders who are committed to DOC by adult courts and placed with OIA due to their age. And most of the youth in our custody, as you can see, are male, which is pretty consistent with the entire criminal justice system. The crimes, as you can see, that bring youth to OIA are pretty severe. Offenses include murder, rape, arson, robbery, other violent crimes, property offenses, and drug offenses. Our female youth commit the same types of crimes, but in different proportions. You can see here that the proportion of male youth who commit sex offenses, for example, is much larger compared to female youth, and the proportion of person crimes is much larger among female youth compared to male youth. And then another big discrepancy there is with substance abuse and alcohol crimes is much higher among female youth compared to male youth. Along with even though they have committed some very serious felonies, it's also very important to remember that many of these youth were victims before they were perpetrators, and many face mental health and developmental challenges, and many, as you'll find out in a little bit, have received treatment or services for these challenges prior to coming into our care and custody. You can see a very high percentage of our youth have abused alcohol and drugs. Very high percentage have parents who have abused alcohol and drugs. Many are diagnosed with a mental health disorder that is other than conduct disorder, although many are also diagnosed with conduct disorder. Many of them were report having been sexually abused prior to coming into our care and custody. Many of them engaged in special education, and we even have a fair proportion of youth who are parents themselves to biological children. So the reason why we like to show this slide is that our dual responsibility at OIA is to address the needs of our youth and the victimization that they've experienced, as well as hold them accountable for having victimized others. And this combined approach is really at the heart of how we protect the public safety by reforming our youth. So some of the key initiatives that we're working on right now are positive human development and the youth reformation system, which Shannon will get into toward the end of our discussion tonight. I really like this statement, so I'm just going to read it. We believe in the human capacity to change, that every person matters, that every interaction is an opportunity for positive intervention. It's especially true for our youth. Every youth deserves to be supported, strengthened, and successful. And we foster this belief through our culture of positive human development and by creating a comprehensive system to guide professional discretion and improve outcomes, and that is the Youth Reformation System. Positive human development is an agency culture that includes positive youth development and also positive staff development. Our culture is shared among staff, youth, our partners, and OIA's organizational structure. And this graphic is kind of depicting what the Youth Reformation System does for us. I'm not going to get too much into it because I think Shannon will get into it a little bit later. But the YRS is mostly comprised of 4 components that work together. At one point, this slide actually moved. The little gears kind of moved together, but it doesn't anymore. The 4 components, briefly, are the population forecast. We are well on our way on that one. We're almost into full implementation on the population forecast. Placement and treatment, program evaluation continuum, and community context. And all of these components work together to really create improved outcomes for our youth. Our overall recidivism rate for juveniles is about 28%. That means that 72% of our youth leave OIA and go on to lead crime-free, very productive lives. And our goal with the Youth Reformation System is to drive recidivism lower by using these data-informed assessments, placements, and treatments to improve the effectiveness of the work that we do. And the focus of my piece of the presentation today is going to be on work that is being done as a part of the YRS initiative, specifically in the community context piece. So the OIA feeder system study isn't really a single study, but rather it's an entire body of work that will probably make up my entire career. And it's a key part of the YRS initiative. We are conducting this work in partnership with a number of other large state agencies, including the Department of Corrections, DHS, OHA, that's the Oregon Health Authority, the Employment Department, the Department of Education, State Police, and all 36 county juvenile departments. We have entered into data sharing agreements with each of these agencies and are linking together administrative data sets to see whether or not we can identify service utilization patterns and characteristics of individuals and families that might help us predict their needs and their likelihood of entering the juvenile justice system. But before I get into the actual details of the data and the findings that we have, I'll give you a little bit of background on how we got here. And I think Deena's talk actually set the stage perfectly for my portion of this. I think anybody in our industry is acutely aware that we tend to serve the same kinds of people, both the social service agencies and the criminal justice system. I kind of like to think of it as existing on one same long continuum. And as you get further and further into down to the juvenile justice or the criminal justice system, the needs of the folks who are getting into that area become a little bit more acute. And we, crossover youth are a very good example of the overlap between our two systems. And we also know that there's a huge overlap between the criminal justice system and mental health issues, and certainly the criminal justice system and substance abuse. So if you think of social services and the criminal justice system as existing on this one long continuum, as you get farther into the system, those services start costing a whole lot more money. For example, the cost to house a youth in closed custody, again, that's in a youth correctional facility at the Oregon Youth Authority, is over $200 a day. The cost per bed at DOC is about $80 a day. And if you think about the cost per bed at the Oregon State Hospital, the Oregon State Hospital per bed cost is $700 a day. So very often individuals who become incarcerated in one of these areas have had multiple contacts with other services prior to committing the crimes that landed them in these services. Excuse me. They may have engaged in mental health treatment, they may have engaged in substance abuse treatment, and all of these contacts with these various systems can kind of be considered missed opportunities to intervene and provide the kinds of treatments or supports that are needed to prevent criminal behavior. Can you hit the slide one more time? Sorry, I forgot about the animation. The one conversation that we had actually with a psychiatrist who used to work at the Oregon State Hospital he indicated that he had a patient that was arrested. Oh, sorry, one more back. He was arrested 99 times before he actually ended up in the Oregon State Hospital. So those were 99 missed opportunities where he was arrested and booked and released that could have been rallied around this person to provide the kinds of supports and potentially treatment that he needed so that he wouldn't commit an egregious crime that was egregious enough to get him to the state hospital. The problem that we have, though, is that there are not enough resources available to invest in these earlier programs that might be able to prevent entry into these more expensive systems. And maybe that's because all of the expensive systems are sucking up all the money. But one solution is to move resources from later, more expensive services like the Department of Corrections, the Oregon Youth Authority, and the state hospital to these services that could be provided at an earlier time point to potentially prevent that criminal behavior. And so our hope with linking all these data sets together is that we would be able to conduct analyses that might produce findings to help guide decision makers and policymakers to target specific services that, through our analyses, might appear to prevent involvement in these more expensive criminal justice systems. Okay. So really quick, our data sources for this study are huge, but today I'm just going to focus on two analyses of OIA youth's history in these first DHS and OHA program areas. So you can see from the list here we have medical assistance, so that's the Oregon Health Plan, Medicaid, self-sufficiency that consists mostly of SNAP, that's commonly known as food stamps, and TANF, which is temporary assistance to needy families. We have data from child welfare, so that includes both substantiated claims for maltreatment and foster care episodes, alcohol and drug treatment services, mental health treatment services, and then obviously the Oregon Youth Authority, we have data for probation commitments, closed custody commitments, and then parole. So the focus of my first two reports, which is what I'll talk about today, are really on those on DHS, OHA, and Oregon Youth Authority, but we also have entered into data sharing agreements with all 36 county juvenile departments, which was a huge win for our partnership. Employment Department, Department of Education, the Oregon State Police, and the Oregon Department of Corrections. So I have conducted two analyses. The first was a preliminary exploratory analysis of this DHS and OHA service utilization for youth who were committed to OIA. And then the second one is a comparison of these OIA youth to a randomly selected group of individuals who were about the same age but were not committed to OIA. So for the first study, just really quickly with the sample, it was about 10,000 youth who were committed to Oregon Youth Authority probation or closed custody between January 2000 and July 2013, mostly male, as our population tends to be. Average age of commitment was about 15 and a half. Race and ethnicity you can see there. Most of the youth in the sample were committed to OIA probation. And the average risk of recidivism, that's the risk of being adjudicated for a felony within 3 years of either closed custody commitment or commitment to probation. Closed custody release or commitment to probation was about 25%. And then the average risk of recidivism for a violent crime was about 15%. So pretty typical sample for our population. So overall, our data indicate that 90% of the youth in this sample accessed at least one of these 5 program areas prior to coming to our care and custody. This finding was pretty staggering for me. Out of 10,000 youth, only 900 of them had no contact with a service prior to coming to OIA, according to our data. The most commonly accessed program from this analysis was medical assistance, followed by self-sufficiency. I can't see the colors. Oh, it's right in front of me. Mental health treatment services, about 58%. Alcohol and drug treatment services, about 40% of the youth in this sample accessed those treatment services at least once before coming to our care and custody. 21% had interactions with Child Protective Services, and 19% had at least one foster care episode. I like to mention on this slide that, especially with the mental health treatment services and alcohol and drug treatment services, this is individual level data. So that is not their parents having access to these services. It's the actual youth, him or herself, who have been engaged in this service prior to coming to our care and custody. I looked at the average amount of time that passed between youth first accessing one of these 5 social service programs and then their commitment to OIA. Overall, it appears that Child Protective Services seems to occur first on average in a child's life, about 6 years before coming to OIA commitment, followed by foster care, self-sufficiency, and medical assistance at about 5 years before they come to our care. Mental health treatment services about 3 years, and alcohol and drug treatment services much closer to the date of their commitment. You can see the purple line kind of spiking up there within the last 12 to 24 months of their date to commitment. I should mention here in this slide again that we have not yet incorporated juvenile department data into this analysis. So many times youth who come to our care and custody have had interactions with the county juvenile department, either through a formal accountability agreement or an informal accountability agreement, or even county probation. And since that data is not recognized in this analysis, we have no way of knowing whether or not this ramp up sort of in engaging in treatment right before coming to OIA was due to their contact with the juvenile department. We suspect that it is. That if we were to tease apart what happened before any contact with the juvenile department, perhaps these numbers wouldn't be quite as high right before coming to the juvenile justice system in general. The average age at first program contacts looks to be about 10 for self-sufficiency, foster care, and child protective services, about 11 for medical assistance, about 12 for mental health treatment services. So on average, they are accessing mental health treatment services at about age 12, and about 15 for alcohol and drug treatment services. And what I should mention on this slide as well is that there's a significant amount of overlap between all of our data sets. For example, and I'd like to bring it up here because folks who work in the child welfare system are kind of surprised by the sort of later age of first contact within the child welfare data in our youth. And I really think that has a lot to do with the overlap in the data sets. For example, the OIA data that I have goes from 2000 to 2013. The child welfare data that I have goes from 1998 to 2011. So for a kid who is committed to OIA in 2000, I only have 2 years worth of child welfare data to look at for them. But for a kid who's committed in 2013, I have 15 years worth of child welfare data to look at for them. So these average age at first involvements are likely pretty inflated. And especially in the child welfare data, the foster care and the child protective services, they're probably much younger. There are lots of patterns of overlap that we saw within these program areas. There's inherent overlap. There seems to be in the policies within DHS and OHA. For example, when a child is placed in foster care, he or she is automatically eligible to receive medical assistance benefits, and also automatically referred to a mental health treatment assessment and sometimes treatment if needed. So we saw that in the data. There's a pretty significant overlap between foster care and both mental health treatment and alcohol and drug treatment. Same for child protective services. And then there was also a large amount of overlap between having accessed alcohol and drug treatment and mental health treatment. But on average, our kids in this sample anyway accessed between 2 and 3 of these programs prior to coming to OIA. So not only were there opportunities potentially to intervene with these kids before they came to OIA, there were multiple opportunities from different program agents, from different agencies. I also looked at differences in program access by different characteristics. So I looked at commitment type, gender, race, ethnicity, and recidivism risk. And a couple of key findings from that are that youth who were committed to OIA closed custody were more likely than youth who had been committed to, say, probation to have accessed foster care, which is very in line with what Deena was saying with her overlap that they see. Female youth, as opposed to male youth, were significantly more likely to have previous contact with child protective services and foster care. And that's actually pretty consistent with the field and the literature that we know. Hispanic and Latino youth have unequal access to mental health treatment services. There were many fewer Hispanic and Latino youth who had accessed those services prior to coming to OIA, fewer than what we would have expected. And we're thinking that that could be language barriers, cultural barriers, things of that nature. African American youth are disproportionately involved in self-sufficiency and foster care. We see more African American youth in those agencies than what we would expect. And prior contact with alcohol and drug treatment services seems to be related to higher risk scores, higher recidivism risk scores at intake. So now that we have a good understanding of the program utilization patterns of OIA youth alone, I compared them to a group of folks who also accessed the same kinds of programs but did not end up accessing the Oregon Youth Authority. I pulled the comparison group just randomly from a pool of individuals who were between the same ages during the same time. So it's terrible to say, but they would have been eligible for OIA services during the same dates that are covered by the OIA cohort. And you can see kind of the comparison of the group characteristics there. The only criteria was that they had to be involved with at least one of these DHS or OHA programs prior to their 19th birthday. I randomly selected from that group. And our findings there, you can go forward, is that compared to the comparison group, our OIA youth tend to access different programs at different rates. So you can see the largest discrepancies there are between mental health treatment, alcohol and drug treatment, and the two child welfare programs we looked at. Many more OIA youth in our sample tended to access those programs prior to the study end date. And they also access a larger number of programs. You can go forward, thanks. From the comparison group, these kids were much more likely to have accessed just a single program, and most of the time that was either self-sufficiency or medical assistance. About the same number accessed only two programs, but then as you start getting to more and more programs and more needs, it looks like the OIA youth are more likely to have accessed a larger number of programs. This big scary slide with lots of scary numbers on it is the results of a logistic regression model that we conducted, basically where we plugged this data into a statistical software package and asked it to tell us which were the most important programs or the programs that were most heavily involved in predicting whether or not a kid was going to be in the Oregon Youth Authority group or the comparison group. And from the red numbers there, you can see that alcohol and drug treatment services involvement, approximating an alcohol and a substance abuse need, was most important in predicting whether or not a kid was going to be in the Oregon Youth Authority group. The odds ratios there on the left-hand side can actually be interpreted as, so if you are a person in this sample and you have a history of participating in alcohol and drug treatment service, meaning that you had a substance abuse need, that person was almost 8 times as likely to be from the Oregon Youth Authority group as opposed to the comparison group. Similar with the mental health treatment involvement, if you had a mental health treatment service prior to the study end date, you were then almost 5 times more likely to be involved with OIA later. Foster care involvement was almost 4 times the probability of going to OIA. And I should mention here too that involvement in these programs certainly does not mean that involvement created the problem and made them go to the Oregon Youth Authority. Instead, we like to say that and it's true that program involvement really just approximates the need for service. So involvement in a given program, we are interpreting it as signifying a need for that service, and it's the need that drives the probability to OIA commitment, certainly not the service itself. So just real quick comparison, the OIA youth tended to participate more often in alcohol and drug treatment services and mental health treatment services and foster care. Whereas the comparison group, interestingly, was more likely to have participated in self-sufficiency. We're still kind of toying around with explanations for that, but one of the theories that we are batting around is potentially that it is could be indicative of caretaker ability to seek resources. And really, there's nothing more to be said about that except that it deserves more attention, really, and more data. I will skip, I think, the limits to interpretation because I feel like I've spoken about those as we went on here. But one that I would like to say is that this is not a prospective study. That's usually the best way to conduct analyses like that, is to find kids when they're born and follow them until they're 19 and see what happens to them. So the comparison is far from perfect, but it's kind of the best that we can do with this really great data.
Hey, is it about time to turn it over to Shannon?
Yes, I have one more slide.
Okay.
So the first study that I just went over explored the prevalence of social service utilization among OIA youth and really just confirmed the notion that there are opportunities for early involvement and early intervention. The second study identified specific areas that deserve further attention, and as we just saw, those are mental health treatment, alcohol and drug treatment, and foster care. And our next analysis, we're going to be incorporating more data and focusing a little bit more on individual and family level characteristics that might be related to the probability of OIA commitment.
Thank you. I think we could probably spend several days, possibly weeks, digesting all this, but Shannon's going to address the next piece of this. Please.
Yeah, good evening. It's really nice to be in Multnomah County specifically, but also as a native Oregonian, I can say it's nice to be in Oregon because there's a couple things about the Oregon juvenile justice system that I think are worth noting. One is that we're data rich. We have a lot of data available to us, and we have incredible passion, as you can hear from Deena's presentation and Margaret's presentation, that people who work in juvenile justice in Oregon are on the cutting edge of some pretty exciting things. We're thinking about things differently, and we are all about outcomes for youth and families, protecting our communities and making sure that youth and families are healthy. It's, slide, thank you. So Deena and Margaret both provided some pretty compelling information to you, and I get the pleasure of kind of rounding out all of the smart people talk. And that's really interesting because I was watching your faces and I was watching the concern and the head nods and the eyes opening, thinking about the fact that youth who are coming into Oregon's juvenile justice system are coming in with complex sets of needs. They're coming in with histories and stories that very rarely can be boiled down to one number, one decision, one idea, one concept. And what I'm here to talk a little bit about is what are we doing with all this data that we're so rich in Oregon to help inform professional discretion of the folks who are working in juvenile justice in Oregon. Margaret mentioned earlier our recidivism risk assessment. She's talked about the ORA and the ORA-V, and that's a youth's risk for committing a felony within 3 years of being committed to probation or being released from one of our facilities. She also talked about a similar score for violent crime. And I just want to put a little context around what that number is, because it's a pretty important number. It tells us something about what's going on with that young person. And that comes from this juvenile justice information system in Oregon. Another great part about being an Oregonian is that we have a long history of partnerships. You heard in Deena's presentation that Multnomah County is mentoring Washington County and Marion County is mentoring Lane County. There's a long history of juvenile justice partnership in this state that is unmatched in any other state in the country, in my opinion. So we're working with great information and great partnerships. And so that information system is where we keep all this information about young people. And that's where we're going to get all this data. So it's telling us what is a youth's risk for actually committing this crime, and how do we understand how to best serve that youth given their risk for committing another crime? Because we are, at the end of the day, public safety agencies who care very much about doing that, but we also want to do it in a developmentally appropriate way. Risk is just one part of the picture, though. We would never, as a system, as a juvenile justice system, ever want to think about youth as only their risks. And I don't have to tell you, after Deena and Margaret's presentations, that youth who are coming in have complex sets of needs. And one of the tools that our youth reformation system has created is what we call a typology. What you can see on that graph is a bunch of lines, long red lines and short green lines. What that basically tells us about a young person is on day one, when you're sitting in front of me, young person, this tells me a little bit about what's going on with you. The longer the line, the more intense the factor. If it's a red line, we're concerned. If it's a green line, that's something that's going well for you. Deena talked a little bit about finding strengths. One of the actual tenets of, I think you called it a vision, an operating principle, is looking for the strengths in families and finding out what's going well. And that's what we're looking for here as well. Although we only have 2 indicators right now, we will eventually be expanding this as our data grows. So we're really thinking about what are those complex needs and how do we address them? How do we use them in case planning, and how do we make sure that you're in the right setting? And that's another tool that we're working with our county partners and the Oregon Youth Authority staff now. We call it predicted success rates. So because we know youth are coming in with lots of different needs, lots of different family histories, lots of different issues that we want to address meaningfully, we want to think about what's the best setting. Margaret talked about closed custody facilities. Deena talked about not wanting to make sure that we're not incarcerating youth if it's unnecessary, that, you know, there's lots of information out there that out-of-home placements, taking a kid out of their home, is really not a great idea. If we can avoid it, we want to try to avoid it. So in this case, we're taking a look at what this data tells us, this over 20 years worth of data on how we've made decisions about young people in Oregon. What is it telling us? And it turns out it's telling us some pretty compelling information about where we've been successful with these young folks. Have we been successful in county probation settings where we're wrapping services around them and working to keep the kid in their home? Are they successful if they have an out-of-home placement in a residential setting where they can get some meaningful treatment? Are they successful if they come to a closed custody setting? So we're understanding not only what is your risk and what is your needs in a very sort of comprehensive way, we're also thinking about where have we been successful in the past and how does that impact the decision that we're about to make regarding how to address this youth. I was actually like just about jumped out of my chair when I saw Deena's sandbox slide. Because I was like, oh, this is so great, and I think I'm going to steal it. It's a great idea because what we're talking about is thinking about how to change the lens of how we look at young people. And so you might remember that slide, and she talked about how child welfare looks at the youth as a victim. Juvenile justice, she used the word perpetrator. Sometimes it's called villain. So we're thinking about youth using these lenses. What's wrong with you, and what have you done? And I think what the crossover model is driving us to do, and what things like the youth reformation system and what I'm about to talk about with positive human development is driving us to do, is to think about youth and families as resources that we can develop, that we can wrap around and work with to prevent these issues from occurring in the future. Margaret spoke at the very beginning of her presentation about positive youth development. And for those of you who are thinking about youth development in general, PYD, as it is called, has decades of research behind it. It comes from 4-H. We know a lot about how to work with young people in ways that help them develop. And now we're starting to think about how do we put that into a juvenile justice world? Because those kids absolutely need it. I don't think we need any more convincing after my colleagues spoke tonight that these folks need some opportunities to develop. But Margaret also mentioned that we've thought about it in terms of staff and the adults that work with these young people. They're developing too. We're all developing. How do we come up with how do we create environments that really foster that? And we developed what we call positive human development. It's a framework for thinking about how to interact with one another. And positive in this case doesn't mean walking around with a big smile on your face, which is what I do absolutely all the time. Positive really is about being healthy. It's optimal. It's looking for those strengths. It's looking for opportunities to grow. And human refers to every individual that we come into contact with every day. And development is defined by changes in our behavior and abilities over time. So what we're after is positive or optimal changes in every person over time as we develop. We've developed this framework. And so if you think about that sandbox and you think about how to play in each other's sandboxes and find a way to work together, we developed kind of these principles, these ideas around what is it that's most important to us when we think about positive human development? How many of you are familiar with Maslow's hierarchy of needs? Any psych majors in the room? Yeah, so we stole it in a way. And what we stole is the concept that when you have something at the bottom, you are more likely to kind of progress. And he would have called it self-actualization. Basic needs have to be in place before you can become self-actualized. And in this case, it's not that different, although we're thinking about it in terms of day-to-day interactions in a juvenile justice world. So first and foremost is safety and security. And in a corrections environment, we're thinking about physical safety and security. But also with positive human development, we're thinking about things like emotional and psychological safety and security. So how do we let youth and our staff and the folks that we come into contact with every day know what's about to happen? It can be really scary if your kid's just been adjudicated and is perhaps facing an adult charge that Margaret spoke about earlier. We call it a Measure 11 offense. That can be a very scary process for a family. There's a lot of unknowns. How do we engage that family? And I can tell you Multnomah County does an amazing job with engaging families in that pre-adjudicatory process. That's because Deena runs it. So we think about, how do you keep families informed? Caring and supportive. What does that mean for us? It means I am interested in what's going on with you, and I'm willing to be a resource to you. That we have a predefined relationship that's about me recognizing that you need something and that I can be a resource for you. But we are holding youth accountable, and we do have high expectations for young people that they can achieve. They can become productive citizens of our communities. Margaret said most of these youth are going to be coming back to our communities. How can we situate them to be those productive, crime-free citizens? Has anyone in this room been to a meeting and thought, what just happened to the last hour of my life? And we would call that not meaningful participation. And in this case, we want to know, what are you bringing to the table? What are you bringing to the table? Young person, county partner, residential provider, staff person, manager. What are you bringing to the table? And how can we use that together collectively to build this resource of a healthy juvenile justice system? We also believe very wholeheartedly that we can do our best work in the juvenile justice world, but if we aren't educating and empowering our communities to work with us and to understand the needs of youth, that maybe that work isn't going to get us all the way there. So we're really around connecting to communities. This is one example of how we do that. Educating a little bit about what it is that we're working with and how people can own a piece of the juvenile justice process. So for OIA, and I know Multnomah County practices a lot of these principles as well, we have identified that PhD is what we would call our culture. So the youth reformation system, which is the tools that Margaret talked about, or the kind of the gear chart that Margaret showed you in the beginning, and the tools that I just mentioned and the research that's going into this, that's our system. That's what we do. How do we help youth become productive, crime-free citizens? And our culture is, what do those interactions look like? How are we doing that? How are we creating situations where folks can hold themselves accountable to meet their expectations and to become productive parts of our communities? And so it's been a real pleasure to share OIA's work and also to be up here, with representation from Multnomah County, because in my job, I get an opportunity to talk to states all over the country, and we are very proud of what we do here. We're often thought of as leaders in the country. And so it's nice to be able to share that with community members, because I'm very proud of the work that Oregon does around juvenile justice. And I hope that tonight's been informative and energizing and something that you can feel proud of as community members. Thank you.
Thank you so much, all of you. Now, we do have some time for questions from the audience, if there are any. There were index cards, I think, passed out, and
Margaret might sing the answers. Remember, she's a soprano.
ooh, now that sounds really nice.
I will not be singing any answers.
Thank you. Okay. Sometimes I have the good fortune of having somebody actually look at these questions so that I can sort of prioritize things. The first question is for the OIA, I assume, why can you keep youth until the age of 25? I thought you were not a youth anymore after the age of 18.
Great question.
In many ways, we are considered to be adults after we turn 18. Is there a good answer for that? Or
It's a great question. We have authority to keep youth until their 25th birthday, so long as their crime that they committed happened before their 18th birthday. And in cases like being committed as an adult, so you would be processed in adult court, you will be serving what we call a determinate sentence. And that just means that there's a length of time, maybe it's 3 years, maybe it's 5 years, that you've been sentenced to. And if you're coming to the Youth Authority through the juvenile court process, we have indeterminate sentencing, which means that the Youth Authority can decide kind of when you've met your treatment goals and are ready to go. We try very hard not to send youth to the Department of Corrections until we absolutely have to, because we tend to be, and this is not meant to discredit any of Department of Corrections programming, but we tend to be very focused on education, vocation, and treatment at the Youth Authority, and it's a good opportunity for youth to get those needs met. They may not have that same opportunity at the Department of Corrections, but we do have separate housing for youth who are serving and would be over the age of 18 versus youth who are under the age of 18. There's federal law around sight and sound requirements that we are paying attention to, but we are very successful with youth that we can keep in our custody and care as long as we can once they are paroled out of our system. If you committed your crime after your 18th birthday, though, you're not coming to OYA. So in this, let me just give you a very concrete example. Let's say that you're a 15-year-old and you've committed a crime in a community, and that district attorney wants to charge you as an adult, and you're serving a 6-year sentence. You could come, once you're sentenced, from the age of 15 and serve that 6 years with us and not ever have to touch adult prison.
Okay, here's a comment and a question. It's sad that we were doing early intervention with these populations in North Portland decades ago. We did well, yet political winds shift. We were defunded. How can you keep your forward movement and continuity? And I think the question is, how do you cope with funding changes as politics change over time?
Well, and new people come in and want to put their names on things and change things.
This speaks to the culture that you develop.
I'll answer that, Bob. I think that's a piece of it. Like, anytime you have a new leader of anything, whether it's the public sector or private business or whatever, there's going to be the flavor or the passion or the commitment that new leaders have. But I actually think, I'll speak just for Multnomah County Juvenile Justice System, much of our having to eliminate early intervention and prevention type works was very much the result of budget cuts, 13 years of budget cuts. So I remember we took our first mid-year cut in 2000, and we took cuts every year. And when we had to look at what's our core mission and what's our core, our purpose for being, it wasn't really the early intervention prevention. It was, okay, the kid's at our doorstep, and now what? I think I'm very excited. We have a leadership that is trying to restore that prevention, early intervention approach. But things like the crossover youth practice model don't require funding. They require business practice changes, right? Mm-hmm. It does not.
That's my next question.
Oh, okay. So you can implement strategies, business practices, whatnot, that don't require more money. They require us to do our business in a more data-driven, evidence-informed way.
Now, before we go on to other questions, there's an interesting comment and some questions from a youth. I'm currently a youth in OYA custody. We as children don't fully mentally develop until 25. If these studies are proven, why are we constantly overwhelmed with rules and regulations? Why isn't there more positive, why aren't there more positive treatment services provided where we are not basically reprogrammed? So from a youth's point of view, there is a certain amount of rote programming that may be attempted in the systems. That's exactly what you're working to
Reduce.
reduce, yes.
Yes. Yeah. So you're absolutely right. The brain typically isn't done developing until our mid-20s. And so we are dealing with a developing brain, which is why that environment piece about being this positive human development piece is so critical for us to understand. In Oregon, at the state level, there is a bit of legislation called Senate Bill 267, and it requires agencies that work with youth. I think it's Margaret, it's DOC, OYA, and perhaps some alcohol and drug programming to use what's called evidence-based practices. And so there are curriculum that the broader research suggests is effective in one way, shape, or form. And we are required to spend 75% of our treatment dollars, if you will, on programs that have been shown to work. So it certainly is going to feel like A manualized, for example, is what we hear, a very structured approach to addressing a specific need. And sometimes those programs are very effective. The research suggests that they are effective in certain populations. And what we're really learning out of the state of Washington, and I think in our own studies, is that the delivery of that and the environment of that matters just as much as what you're saying. So just as much as the program is important, it's who's delivering it, how it's delivered, and the environment in which it is delivered. We're always going to use programs that we know work with our populations. Right now, we're focused on creating environments that support that development and kind of help that flourish. And if my colleagues have anything to add. But I'm a big brain geek, so I love that question.
That's great.
I wanted to bring my brain slides, but I didn't.
I am not quite sure what a few of these questions mean, but this one I think maybe you've addressed it in some measure. How can you stabilize your community partners and prevent and lessen turmoil and turnover in that arena, in those connections between the community and the services agencies?
You know, I see them as the direct service people. And so two questions there is, how will that resource base be expanded? Because as you pointed out, 99 opportunities were lost probably because nobody could find resources. So if you're going to do early intervention, then how are you going to expand those early intervention resources? I'm retired, I'm not looking forward.
So-
And at the same time, how can you stabilize them so that you don't lose the connections that the families make with these individuals?
So I will just speak for Multnomah County. Our entire approach to how we case manage, how we involve youth in treatment has become very family focused. The evidence-based model that we use for case management is called functional family probation. We are all about connecting kids with resources in their community so they don't need to come back to juvenile justice to get their needs met. The lens, I guess, through which we look at every decision point really has made a shift to being individually, like youth voice and family focused, and that requires a look at how do we partner with our community. So we have done quite a bit of community building, resource allocation, identifying where there are gaps, how can we come together, recognizing that kids and families shouldn't come to the system to get their needs met, right? They shouldn't have to become a delinquent or a dependent child to get their mental health treatment needs met or their basic needs met. So it's actually just sort of a lens, I think, that at least from our agency has become the norm as opposed to working in isolation.
So you're feeling that the resources are out there?
Do I think we could use more? I think we could use more, but we have to get creative with what we have. We need to support each other when we identify service gaps, and I think we do. We're intentional about that.
This question has to do with OYA, and it's based on an assumption that OYA's policies, procedures, and clinical treatment is based on behaviorism. To what extent is this compatible with, there are a number of different, sound a little bit technical phrases: trauma-informed care, motivational interviewing, collaborative problem solving, positive youth development, etc. Are they compatible? Is OYA moving away from behaviorism? Big one.
I have my soulmate in this audience, I'm sure of it. So, I'm kidding. Maybe. In the back, there's some handouts, and you saw the concentric circle diagram that got thrown up at the end when I was talking about positive human development and how that fits in our agency. Our tools and practices are collaborative problem solving, trauma-informed care, motivational interviewing. How do you engage youth in meaningful ways? So as not a fan of behaviorism, I think it's not surprising that we're looking for behavior to occur and we're looking for behavior change. And you can align your system around those things. But we've learned a lot about how adolescents are growing and developing, brain science. We're responding to that. Juvenile justice is responding to that nationally. So to say that we were moving away from behaviorism, I'm not sure that I could say that we were ever truly kind of pitching our tent in the behaviorism camp. What I can say is that we are moving toward a developmentally appropriate model of doing juvenile justice.
And I would just like to add with the trauma-informed care, this is another proud to be an Oregonian moment. We have something in our state called Trauma-Informed Oregon, which is a huge group of people from all sorts of disciplines that are working together to create trauma-informed systems from, not just juvenile justice and child welfare, but education and physical health and all of that. Personally, just in our juvenile services division, we have over 200 employees, both regular and on-call. Every single one of them was put through a 12-hour training on a 3-part series training on trauma-informed care. It's something that we know we cannot ignore. We need to make sure that our practices are addressing not only the trauma that is experienced by the youth and families that we serve, but also how our staff are experience trauma through the work that they do, helping families who live through some pretty horrific events. So I'm really proud of Oregon in our leadership around trauma-informed care.
Thank you. I think we have time for one more question. What is your relationship with the education community? I'm assuming that this question is directed to close custody particularly. I'm not sure that's correct. How are the youth that are in, it looks like close custody, educated, and is it effective?
Great.
We have high schools in all of our facilities that are taught by certified K through 12 licensed teachers in Oregon. So there are schools in dedicated school spaces in each of our facilities where youth are coming off of their what we call a living unit and attending school. We are supporting our youth in getting their high school diploma, if at all possible. Credit recovery is a big priority for us. As you might not be surprised, we do have youth who come in with very few credits, if any credits at all. So our primary focus is to get them engaged in the educational environment. We just had a student, we've got a couple bachelor's degrees that we just awarded in the last academic year so we have kids who are attending college online. And so our education system continues to be robust. We've partnered with some national organizations around how to kind of ensure high quality education inside a correctional environment. So,
and correct me if I'm wrong, Shannon, the high schools that we have in our facilities are public schools that are
they're operated by the Education Service District. So for example, at McLaren Youth Correctional Facilities operated by Willamette Education Service District.
And for youth who are detained locally in our Multnomah County Detention Facility, they also receive full day of school, and that's operated through the Multnomah Education Service District as well. So kids that are detained locally, not in the state facilities, do also get school.
Well, I think we have just about come to the end of our time. Thank you all so much for presenting for us tonight. This has really been a very interesting and enlightening discussion. Thank you so much.